Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword.
Following the signing of the 10-year non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin, Hitler advanced on Poland. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler sent German troops and tanks to the Polish border and German aircrafts to bomb the Polish capital, Warsaw, an attempt to take total control of the country. Before France and Great Britain could react to heavy German presence in Poland, the Polish country collapsed into Nazi rule. This successful invasion by the German army was a test of new military tactic known as the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. In this strategy, quickly accelerating tanks and aircrafts preceded by massive ranks of soldiers overwhelmed and shocked the enemy.
Marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel, written burnished rows of steel.
After the fall of France in June 1940, Great Britain was solo on its defense and attack on the Nazis. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, was Britain's asset to the war and declared publicly that his country would surrender under no conditions. Because of this statement, Hitler turned his focus to the invasion of Britain. Hitler's plan was to eliminate the Royal Air Force, then march 2,500,000 soldiers on English soil. Later in 1940, the German Air Force began bombing British airfields and aircraft factories. September 7, 1940, the German Air Force moved to bombing major cities like London. But despite the circumstances, Britain did not weaken. The Royal Air Force came back full force with bombing and new technological advances on the Nazis. With possession of newly invented radar and German code-making machine called Enigma, Britain had the ability to tell the number, speed, and direction of incoming war aircraft, and allowed British officials to decode German secret messages. The bombings on Britain became only present at night, a preference of the Germans so that the Royal Air Force could not fight back. Because of the bombings, London citizens crowded into underground subways or home basements. May 10, 1941, Hitler called off his attacks due to the forceful British resistance. The Battle of Britain taught the rest of the Allied forces that Germany can be blocked, which was very impactful, mind-altering insight in the perspective of the generals and soldiers.
Though originally the United States attempted to avoid World War II involvement, 1939 President Roosevelt saw the inevitable and decided to take small measures to prepare for war. Allies could now buy American arms with cash on American soil due to the Neutrality Acts annulled and the Lend-Lease Act in force. By the end of December 1941, U.S. Navy ships were conducting British ships filled with American arms. This caused Hitler to be outraged and order his submarines to sink any cargo ships they come in contact with. On September 4th, a German U-boat fired upon a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic Ocean, causing Roosevelt to order his men to shoot any German submarine on sight. Though this attack was not the reason the United States joined the war, it drew up another reason for the U.S. to aid its allies.
By July 1941, the U.S. had sent troops to aid China in resistance against Japan and cut off oil shipments to Japan as Japan advanced in Southeast Asia. Despite the oil shortage, Japan continued their attacks, planning massive attacks on British and Dutch colonies in the Southeast Asia and American outposts in the Pacific. Ordered by Admiral Isaraku Yamamoto, the U.S. fleet in Hawaii was said to be a dagger pointed in Japan's throat and needed to be destroyed. The morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japanese sent air raids to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within only 2 hours of attack, immense damage and loss had occurred. 19 ships and 8 battleships had been sunk, and over 2,300 Americans were killed with roughly 1,100 injured. While this event was occurring, Japanese also launched bombing raids on the British colony of Hong Kong and the American-controlled Guam and Wake Island. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, saying December 7, 1941 would forever be a date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war on Japan and its allies, receiving a rapid positive response.
April 1942, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, 16 B-25 bomber aircrafts bombed Tokyo as well as several other Japanese cities. Though the bombs did little damage compared to the damage inflicted by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, the raid made a very large psychological impact on Japan and America. The point made across by this attack was Japan is vulnerable to attack, raising American morale and shaking Japanese confidence. By May that year, Australian and American fleet stopped a Japanese attempt to capture an Allied air base. The interception was transformed into the Battle of the Coral Sea. Though the ships themselves never fired a single shot, damage and casualties were caused by airplanes from either side attacking the ships from above. The Allies suffered heavier losses than Japan. However, the battle was considered an Allied victory because they had stopped Japan's southward advance. Soon after, Japan targeted Midway Island, a small island with a major American airfield, 1,500 miles west of Hawaii. Because of the Allied forces' codebreakers, the commanding chief of the airfield knew the Japanese were approaching. In preparation for the attack, American forces hid behind the horizon as Japanese planes arrived in Midway. The American planes swooped into the Japanese fleet, destroying 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers and 1 support ship. The Battle of Midway ended June 7, 1942, leaving uprisen courage in the Allied forces' hearts.
As Adolf Hitler rose to power, he brought the deep-rooted hatred of Jewish people into modern culture of Germany and its surrounding countries. For generations, Jewish people had been the scapegoat for failures by Germans and other Europeans. Small blames escalated into Jewish people being the reason for Germany's defeat in World War I. As this discrimination occurred, the Nazis made targeting the Jewish people a government policy. Jewish people were segregated, tortured, discriminated, dehumanized, and placed into concentration camps to eliminate their existence in Hitler's eyes.
In November 1938, a Jewish boy received a postcard that read his father had been deported to Poland. Out of anger, the teen shot a German diplomat living in Paris. Once news reached back to the Nazi leaders in Germany, they began a violent, destructive attack on the Jewish community. November 9, 1938, Nazi stormtroopers destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, shops, and synagogues across Germany, killing close to 100 Jews. The streets were covered in ruins of what was a peaceful community, from the shattered glass to the smashed furniture. This night became known as the Kristallnacht, meaning Night of Broken Glass.
The mass genocide that Hitler referred to as the final solution was his plan to completely wipe the Jewish race and anyone he deemed unfit for his master race from Germany and the world. These Jews and the undesirable people were placed in concentration camps. In these camps, many were killed on sight, forced to work, and starved to death. Everything these people had was robbed from them: their family, friends, possessions, their dignity. Once one was seen as weak or unable to work, they were sent to gas chambers. Convinced that they were taking a shower, members of the camps were forced to strip, and the guards would lock the door, and then that was the end. This wicked treatment continued until the camps were liberated in 1945, 12 years after they were opened in 1933.
Home, Americans made tireless contributions to the war effort. Factories produced items needed for the war, from artillery to clothing. America was all in. The proud Americans also rationed off food stamps and salvaged and saved things like scrap metal and kitchen grease to donate to the war effort. The wartime circumstances produced many jobs for the unemployed and for women. Propaganda helped promote these wartime efforts with encouraging slogans and pictures.
The Allied forces prepared to push towards victory in Europe. On June 6, 1944, the Allies attacked the beach of Normandy. This attack, known as D-Day, suffered heavy casualties. The Allied forces, however, stood their ground. The Allied forces punctured a hole in German defenses, and by September had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg.
You've got to give him credit for a son of a gunner was he. Shouting praise.
After failing to resist Allied troops, the Japanese lost many men. The Japanese met the Allies at Iwo Jima and inevitably met their defeat. To ensure the ending of the war, President Truman planned to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The Japanese were warned by the president but never responded. Thus, the bombs were dropped. Finally, the Japanese surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur on September 2nd. The ceremony took place on the ship the Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
With casualties almost 40 million, the Second World War left Europe in ruins and left the people of Europe dead or homeless. Many tried to stay where they were and live in whatever they could salvage, while others took to the road. These survivors and refugees were simply looking for a safe place to live, but wherever they looked, devastation was present. Many survivors of the Holocaust were in search of their families, friends, or any sign of the life that was robbed from them.
Praise the Lord, pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord, pass the ammunition.
Once the war was over and Japan had surrendered, the country was left in ruins. The effect of the atomic bombs had proved that the Allies had stripped Japan of its colonial empire. The occupation of Japan by the Americans had begun. General Douglas MacArthur was determined with this task. MacArthur began the process of demilitarizing, disbanding the military, and democratization, creating a government elected by the people in Japan. MacArthur also helped the farmers of Japan by dividing the land and selling it for fair prices.